pay and working conditions of domestic workers in the current economic climate have been highlighted in a new report. That survey by SweepSouth has revealed that 75% of domestic workers don't make enough money to save, while only 9% have savings and 35% are in debt. SweepSouth Managing Director Luke Kannemeyer speaks to us about this. Thank you so much for your time, Luke. It is a tough economic climate, but one can safely say that the story for domestic workers in terms of pay and conditions has not really changed in South Africa. So talk us through the findings of this current report.
So I think what our clear findings are here is that there's a very, very worrying trend in the industry, in that while many employment sectors bounced back after COVID, what we've seen is steady declines in the level of employment in the domestic work industry. Prior to COVID, it peaked at around 1.2 million, and then that has decreased now to below 800,000. And so what we're seeing, despite no increases in average earnings, really, those have increased only marginally and definitely not kept up with inflation, is that still those domestic workers who are still earning, whereas many now are losing their jobs. And that's expectedly about 1 in 4 are due to affordability, so employers no longer being able to afford domestic work. But also concernedly is around 40% have been due to employers moving home, with around 59% of those moving out of the country. And the concern there is with our brightest and, economically active individuals leaving our shores, is that gap between earnings and costs, which is often covered by our grant system and social protection, that is funded through taxpayer income for the government, and that in a sort of larger systemic sense is painting a very worrying picture for what's to come within the industry.
And that worrying picture brings me to my next question about the near-term outlook here, because as you rightfully have indicated, that the dynamics have changed since the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic impact of that on jobs, as well as the domestic worker industry. But what is going to be even more interesting going into the near-term future of a South African economic landscape that is continuing to be under pressure? What happens to the domestic worker within this climate, in that there is, of course, the social grant services that you indicated, which are still not nearly enough in terms of one who has earned a living before, worked for it, but now has to be in a system or maybe in limbo within a system that exists?
So what we're seeing in the near term is that this industry will continue to be in a very, very precarious position. And that is part of what motivates us to generate this report. This is our 6th one year, and we use it both to measure how we're doing, how the industry is doing, but it also helps us promote change, to engage with government, engage with civil society, and engage with employers. So not just those who are finding domestic workers on our platform. And there really is going to be no turnaround here unless we take action within ourselves. So you'll see even around minimum wage legislation, which is now on a per hour basis, and rightly so, we see domestic workers should be earning the same minimum wage as other workers. But often a domestic worker has their fixed costs in a day, and you being within the minimum wage threshold in a day by reducing hours once you're under pressure as an employer, that doesn't quite gel with the fixed costs that your worker has in terms of getting to work each day. And I think that's just where the shared sense of responsibility and empathy, it really needs to come through, that this isn't an expense that we should be minimizing our homes. It should be something we see as part of our responsibility as a middle class in terms of empowerment.
Absolutely vital, but does that then say that there's a bigger need in South Africa for regulation that outsizes the minimum wage in terms of implementation or the structure of it, so that there is a sustainable model that is going to ensure that there's a safeguarding of jobs for domestic workers, as opposed to the current vice versa situation that we are faced with?
I definitely think that one of the key points here is that, as is often said with not just this sphere of government, is that we have some of the best legislation in terms of protections around domestic work and around employees, but the level of being able to access that is very, very limited. And that's both from an employer point of view and an employee point of view. And so even those workers in our survey that lost their jobs, only around 14% were registered for UIF. And even those who were registered, only about half of them could access the benefit. And that is definitely showing here that there needs to be a serious shake-up in terms of access. But definitely, as you say, there needs to be a catching up with the modern nature of work, with the ad hoc nature of domestic work, with the multiple employer model, that even though we can say that these rights apply to workers, we need to do a much better job of actually being able to drive access. And obviously, once you have broad access and easy access, is then driving enforcement.
Lastly, Luke, it is 6 years of this report, and I'm also interested in finding out when you say that there is a change in trend. Is there one when we look at maybe the type of domestic worker that is now coming into the market, a realignment of maybe an au pair as opposed to just a domestic worker that would be coming in to clean and the sorts? Is the data looking into what type of demographic of domestic worker is coming into the labor landscape in this particular sector, and what is needed there to retain that particular individual within the industry, but with benefits, obviously?
So what we're seeing is that the full-time employed domestic worker for one employer, the live-in domestic worker, that's becoming an increasingly small percentage of the South African market, or at least. So we primarily look at the urban centers of Gauteng and Cape Town, and to a lesser extent Durban. And so this is where a domestic worker is coming in, often taking on more responsibilities, or there's a mix of work to try and supplement earnings, whereas previously a domestic worker would primarily stick with that single profession. And so that's taking on other duties within the home, but also then looking at, they'll work as a domestic worker a few days, but then they won't necessarily be able to work all of their days as a domestic worker and will seek other forms of employment. And that's where we do see this phenomenon of underemployment coming in, so that workers that we see coming on now are really, as I say, in that precarious point of where this is just part of the role, part of the employment that they have, and it certainly isn't steady. And that's, I think, where we do need to rethink these benefits, that we can't frame them in the same way that we see the typical employee in South Africa, but adapt to this worker who will be between formal and informal segments, but also who may be working 3 days this week, 2 days next week, 4 days the next week. That model of work, and that's what we're seeing increasingly now amongst domestic workers, that is where benefits really need to catch up and government needs to put in a rethink into how they model these.
Thank you for your insights. Luke Kannemeyer is the MD at SweepSouth, talking us through this latest report of the organization, highlighting and laying bare the realities of conditions and pay for domestic workers in South Africa amid the current tough economic climate.